Hello, and welcome to the podcast Justice Unbound, about women, religion, and the State of Israel. In this podcast, we take you behind the closed doors of the Israeli rabbinic courts, where hearings are held in camera, closed to the public, and where the state applies religious laws to decide the fate of women trapped in marital captivity, agunot, of children stigmatized because of their mother's sexual partners, mamzerim, of converts who do not keep the Sabbath, and where citizens are cross-examined about whether they are Jewish enough, and much, much more. Justice Unbound is written and produced by the Center for Women's Justice, CWJ. I'm your host, Susan Weiss.
Hi, I'm your host, Rivkah. Today, the plan is to interview you, Susan, about an article that you wrote quite a while ago. It came out, if I remember right, in 2002 in Hebrew, in a publication called Eretz Acheret, and it's still very relevant today. The name of the article is A Woman Acquires Herself in Three Ways, meaning a woman is freed from the marriage in three ways. I love the name, Susan. It refers, I'll just explain to our listeners, to the Mishnah in Kiddushin that talks about the ways in which you marry or divorce, and the Mishnah reads as follows. Citation. A woman is acquired as a wife in three ways and acquires herself in two ways. She is acquired with money or with a document or through marital relations. She acquires herself with a bill of divorce or through the death of her husband. All this is a citation from the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is basically saying that there are three ways to get married, either with money. I think we talked about that in the first or maybe the second episode, that the groom buys her, acquires her with money, with a ring, or with a document, a written contract or some kind of a statement that he takes her as a wife, or through marital relations, when there are two witnesses that he says in front of them, I'm about to have marital relations, and this symbolizes my taking her as a wife. Anyway, those are the three ways that the husband buys the wife, and I love the idea that the Mishnah says it right out, that he acquires her and doesn't make believe it's something holy and sanctified. And she buys herself back, she acquires her freedom in two ways. So we understand the part about the husband dying. That's one way to get out of a marriage. The other way is through a divorce. We know that it's very hard to get out of a marriage if the husband doesn't want to give a divorce. That's what this podcast is about. And you're asking in the article, what are the ways that the religious courts resolve disputed divorce cases? That is, what are the methods that the religious court uses when the husband actually doesn't want to give a divorce? You talk about three methods, and I'm going to give you the floor in a minute to say anything you want. You talk about rigid formalism, extortion, and violence.
Correct.
Go ahead.
Correct. So obviously the title is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it was written after many years of my experience appearing in the rabbinic courts and supervising women who appear in the rabbinic courts on behalf of clients, toanot rabbaniot, you among them.
And one of them was me, right?
You among them. So the first method of divorce resolution that I speak about, as you mentioned, is rigid formalism. What I mean by rigid formalism is that the rabbinic courts don't look to do justice or to do fairness. What they want to do is to obey the law. Okay, so the law is the form, and the rabbis who work in this area are most vigilant in adhering to the form, to the law. Okay, and the law that they adhere to is what we religious feminists will refer to as a patriarchal and misogynist law. And that patriarchal and misogynist law is that the divorce occurs only when the husband says and agrees to the divorce. And the husband has to agree to that divorce of his own free will and without any type of pressure. And that's the rule that really governs everything that happens in the rabbinic courts. So there are many ways that we see this rigid formalism, and one of the ways that I speak about in my article is the fact that they don't give any decision at all. They wait many, many years before they will issue any type of decision, whether it be a decision recommending that a husband give a divorce or a decision ordering him to give a divorce, or, of course, the decision coercing him to give a divorce.
Why is that? Why do they wait many years?
They wait many years because if they're waiting many years, then they don't in any way infringe on the husband's free will.
Right. So they're waiting, actually.
They're waiting. Right. They're waiting for him to finally agree. And most often they do, right? Because if they wait long enough, the couple will give up and the husband will give up and they'll say, okay, let's just get divorced, which obviously solves the problem. I think that situation may have changed a little bit from the way I describe it in my original article. In the original article, I described many, many years of waiting. I think the rabbis will more quickly make some sort of order. But the other thing that I say is that even the orders that they do make, whether it's a recommendation or a order that he give the get, often those orders and those decisions are very empty. In other words, they don't really do anything, right? Because the husband can just say, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to give the get.
Let's just mention the other empty possible decisions that they make. Go to such and such a rabbi and see what he says.
Right. We had a very famous case like that. In fact, we should really speak about that case. That was a case where before the woman got to our offices of Yad Lisha, when I was in Yad Lisha at the time, the rabbis had told her, go to one rabbi, then another rabbi, then another.
Right.
Remember that was like 10 rabbis or something.
You used to say, what does it matter? So what if the rabbi will tell him to give a divorce? He's not going to give the divorce. What change is going to happen from this?
And in fact, that's what happened. He just would go to the rabbi, they would tell him to give the divorce, and then he would say no. And that man, Rivkah, still hasn't given.
Yeah, he never did get, right.
It's 30. It was 10 years by the time she had gotten to us. It took us a while. The rabbis in the lower court didn't do anything. We finally found an excuse to appeal her decisions. I think it was about child support. And in the higher court, they finally ordered him. They said, you must give a get. But they refused to coerce him to do it. And he still refused to give the divorce. So finally, in that particular case, we went to the family court and we sued him for damages. We won't get into that now. And we succeeded. Right. That was the first case in which we got a very high award for damages.
For a different episode.
But in any event, that man is still refusing to give a get. He's now been in jail for 4 years. So I think it's a total of 30 years or so that she's waiting for a get. So that concept of rigid formalism, that they can't do anything for this, even for that lady, right? Ultimately, even the coercion doesn't help, right? Because if he doesn't say, I do, the rabbis have to obey that rigidly formal rule that the get and the divorce only occurs when the husband says yes. So that's what I meant by rigid formalism.
I just want to say something before you go on to the extortion. And that is that I think religious people are so used to religious formalism in other aspects of our religious life that we kind of accept it as a norm. It's like, that's the way halakha is. It's rigid. And that's part of our being religious people, that we keep to weird, fundamentalism or the letter of the law or something like that.
I think you're right.
It's hard to get around.
When I was rereading this article, at first I thought that we would put our emphasis on other methods of divorce resolution that I spoke of. But I really think the rigid formalism is the main idea here. I spoke about this issue recently at the Hartman Institute to the mechanchim, to the educators there. And one of the educators said to me, when we were talking about chalitza, he said, but it's the law, it's the Torah law. It's the eternal, immutable Torah law. What do you want to do, throw it out? So I do think that the whole concept of rigid formalism constrains us, and it doesn't allow us, particularly the rabbis, to take in consideration ideas of justice or fairness or empathy, things that I think that would normally perhaps be within their emotional
in a court of justice
lexicon or in a court of justice, but they can't because this rigid formalism almost suffocates them. It doesn't allow them any type of movement.
Okay, let's go on to extortion. Unless you want to talk about separation, that's also rigid formalism. That's part of the rigid formalism.
What do you mean by separation, Rivkah?
That the couple can be separated for many, many years. And
yes, I think I do write about it in the article, that we see the rigid formalism, especially when a husband is incapacitated or he's missing or he's separated, right? There's nothing they can do. We had a few cases that show this in a very interesting way. I think it was a case that you were involved with, Rivkah, where the man, was in jail for domestic abuse, and he tried to hang himself, and then he became a vegetable, remember? And he had no capacity. And the rabbi sent you home saying, there's nothing we can do.
Nothing can be done.
Nothing can be done because he is incapacitated and cannot give the get. That was one of our cases.
I was thinking about the idea of a couple being separated for many years and then the Beit Din saying, I'm sorry, that's not a reason to give a get. So there may be some rabbis today that are saying that separation for a certain amount of years is a cause for divorce. But I'm holding actually a decision given in 2020 where the husband went to live with another woman and still the Beit Din said that it doesn't matter that they're separated because she left him without a good enough reason. So it doesn't matter what he does afterwards, and it doesn't matter that they're separated for a long time. That is not any reason to enforce him to give the get. So it's just crazy.
I think all the cases that we discussed in the beginning of the podcast that we brought are all examples of that, right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah. No, but what I'm saying is that it still happens. I mean, you were saying that maybe it happens a little less today, and I'm saying it's still 2020, there is a case.
What I mean by less is just that they may be quicker to issue an empty decision. In other words, the decisions are still empty and the decisions still are ineffectual, but they will issue them more quickly than they used to. Because I think of the pressure that the women's groups have brought on them to do something.
Yes, for sure that there's a lot of pressure in terms of the women's organizations, for sure. They're trying to look better, the Beit Din, that's for sure. Okay, so let's go on to extortion.
So extortion. We all know that the husbands may try to extort their wives, right, and gain some sort of benefit in exchange for the get. We also know that lawyers will sometimes even advise their clients to withhold the get. In fact, I know of a very famous lawyer in Jerusalem who told me once, well, of course he should withhold the get because she's not letting him see the kids. In other words, the get, which is a tool that only the man has, the lawyers will even see it as a legitimate leverage over women. But what I talked about in the article was where the rabbis actually recommend extortion as a solution to the get. They will actually say, well, I think it's right that you shouldn't pay child support because the woman can go and get the money from the Social Security Institute, from Bituach Leumi. The state should support her child so that the husband doesn't have to pay child support. That was a case that we were involved in. Or the Aguna fund itself, right, where the rabbis have this fund set up. They will use where a husband is particularly recalcitrant, and they'll tell the husband, well, how much do you need? How much do you need? 5,000 shekels, 10,000 shekels, 100,000 shekels? What can we give you so that you will give get? In fact, I think I may have discussed this in the article. Also, there was a case where a woman's husband was in jail, right? And he managed to extort from her the fact that he wouldn't have to pay child support. And then with the rabbi's support, he also managed to convince her that she had to give a guarantee that he wouldn't sue her for the child support.
That's like a norm almost for men to ask for that. I'll only give you the get if I don't have to give you child support.
The problem is that the rabbis take an active role in this. We saw that recently in the case of Chalitza, right, Rivkah, that you had?
Yes. The woman had to give up all her rights for inheritance.
But the rabbis justify that.
Yes, absolutely. That's also a norm in Chalitza.
And then there's the concept of the Maharashtam. Maybe you'll describe the rule of the Maharashtam that we discovered, remember, when we were working. So
yeah, the rule of the Maharashtam was that even if the Beit Din says that the husband must give a get, when they finally get around to saying that, he still doesn't have to give it if he has any conditions that she hasn't met. So that means he can ask for anything. He can ask for her part of the apartment or any kind of money. And if she doesn't give it, then he can't be enforced to give the get. Even when they at some point take the power and say the husband has to give the get, they'll give in immediately for anything that the husband asks.
That's going back to our rigid formalism where all the rules are stacked in favor of the husband.
Right. Well, extortion and rigid formalism goes together because if you can't solve it, if you have rigid formalism, you have to turn to extortion. I mean, you have to say, I'll pay you whatever you want. I'll give you whatever you want in order to give me the get. I had a very interesting case where it was completely on the table. Now that we're talking about it, I remembered it, where the husband said, I want to go back to Shlom Bayit. And the wife was, he had beaten her and she ran away from him and whatever's terrible situation. But he kept saying, I want to go back to live with her. And the dayan turned to him and said, well, what do you want? And he said, I want to go back to live with her. He said, no. What do you want? And he said it 3 times. And it was like the beginning of my career. And I think that I didn't even understand what he was saying. And he just said it again and again. What do you want? And finally, the guy said, I want $20,000. The rabbi said, now you're talking. I couldn't believe it. And then he turned to her and he said, he wants $20,000. And she said, I don't have the money to give him, and then et cetera, et cetera.
And also, we've seen cases where the woman wouldn't give the husband what he wanted and wouldn't give what the rabbis thought he should get. And then the rabbis would say, At ma'agenet et atzmech. You are now holding yourself up, okay? It's your fault that you're not getting the get.
Right. We had one very famous case in our organization that the woman had everything finished in the civil court. And when they went to get the get, the husband said, I want everything to be opened up again in the religious court and do everything over again. And the woman said, no, I already have decisions from the regular court. I just came for a get. The religious court said, you are causing yourself to be an agunah by not giving in and having us open up all the things that's already been closed in the civil court.
And I remember one case, which I think is even more horrific, although it's very hard to say which one was worse than the other. But there was a client whose husband was refusing to give her a get for a very long time. I think the Bet Din even put him and his father in jail for a few days. Still didn't work. And finally, the husband, together with his father, came back to court and said, you know what? We'll give her the get if she gives up child support completely. And the rabbis turned to our client and said, I think she wasn't while we were representing her, and said, well, okay, now he's willing to give the get. And she said, yeah, well, how are my kids going to eat? And they literally told her to go to the Haredi community and collect money to support her children. And when she said she's not going to do that, and that's not an acceptable solution to her, they used that term, at magenet et atzmech. So that's the extortion.
That's extortion, yes. Okay, violence.
Well, let's get to the violence.
That's the best one. The most unclear, I have to say. The most unclear, and the one that it's basically you that's saying it, and
nobody seems to understand me when I say it.
Nobody seems to.
Okay, so let's talk about violence. Before I go into this, I want to remind you that even your father, when he read this article, he really liked it. I remember, but when it came to the section on violence, he also said, what is she saying here with the violence? Okay, before I get to violence, let me tell you that it's based on an idea from Weber, okay? Weber defines the state as the community that legitimately uses violence, okay? It has the right to use violence. The people agree that this body, which is the state and its actors, can use violence.
They can put people in jail. They can take money from people.
They can kill people in some societies, capital punishment. They can send people to war. They can restrain their rights of travel. They can do all sorts of things that infringe on the autonomy of individuals. What's a democracy? In democratic societies, that power of violence is subjected to significant procedural and substantive boundaries. The victim has access to appeal. The state has to meet certain standards before it exercises violence. It has to obey certain rules. It has to act in manners that are not arbitrary and capricious. It has to act in manners that have due process. It cannot act randomly. The individual is protected by these procedures and by these rules from the violence that is the legitimate right, one might say, or the legitimate activities of a state.
Very interesting. Yes.
What I called violence was their act of putting men in jail for not giving a get. In other words, I felt that it was totally random and capricious when they would order a man to give a get. I feel that a man who doesn't give his wife a get is acting either vengefully or stupidly. He might have some serious psychological problems. There's all sorts of things and reasons, which are probably not good, that a man won't give a get. And the state, instead of saying, okay, this marriage is over, the people aren't living together, they've been separated for 6 months, the husband is incapacitated, there's no chance that this marriage is going to in any way be revived. Instead of saying the marriage is over, they put the man in jail. And the man can sit in jail sometimes for times that's longer than if they had killed somebody or raped somebody. They will be sitting in jail. They could sit in jail for their whole life for not giving a get.
I have to stop you here for a second. The state can't say that the marriage is over because the marriage is a religious marriage, and it's only the rabbis that can say that the marriage is over.
You're going back to our rigid formalism. I'm just saying that this is the way things get handled, not necessarily resolved, but handled in the rabbinic courts. How does it get handled? They don't make decisions. That's our rigid formalism. They extort or encourage extortion, that's extortion, or they resort to violence. They will say, okay, if I put the husband in jail for 2 days, for 3 days, for a week, for a month, for a year, eventually the husband's going to give a get. Okay, so these are the very crude ways, that's how I refer to it, that the rabbinic courts will handle divorce resolution.
And are you saying that it's bad from the side of the rabbis to do that, or it's bad from the side of the state that they're allowing the rabbis to do that? Which is the wrong here?
I think both. I think you and I would like to say that we can reinterpret the halakha in ways that don't require them to use violence, okay? We can use conditional marriage as a solution, for example. But the rabbis, because of their notion of rigid formalism, have to adhere to the ultimate rule, which is that the husband has to give the get. If the husband doesn't give the get, then there is no divorce. So what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? Okay, we're going to put him in jail. Okay, now all of this is a gross violation of basic human rights, which is that the state can't throw people in jail for arbitrary, capricious, or irrational reasons, okay? And in my mind, okay, obviously this is a liberal interpretation of how divorce should occur, but it doesn't make any sense to me that a democratic state should allow state actors, and the rabbis are state actors in this case. They're not just rabbis that you go to for an opinion or for advice. They have power. They have this legitimate power of the state in their hands. And then this is what happens when you give.
And it only happens in Israel.
It only happens.
It's the only country in the world, because it's the only country in the world where the state has given the rabbis this authority to put people in jail. It's really unbelievable if you think about it.
Not even just to put people in jail. And I wanted to tell a story when I was thinking about this before we started this podcast, of the case of Tzvia Gorodetsky's husband, who still hasn't given her a get. And in the Center for Women's Justice, we actually ended up releasing this man from jail after almost 30 years that he was sitting in jail, because she wasn't getting her get, and Tzvia wanted her kids to see their father. We actually went to the rabbinic courts and said, this isn't working, release the man from jail, stop all this violence. And the rabbis were not happy, but they had no choice, because if she asked for it, then they had to release him.
And then they really blame her for not getting the get, because she's not participating with their violence against the husband.
What they did to him at various stages is they said he had no canteen privileges, he couldn't talk to his children, he couldn't be in a cell along with other religious people, he couldn't participate in religious services. He obviously is not the most well person, but he came to the rabbinic courts once when we were there, and we were trying to convince him, right, to give the get to Tzvia, and he said, "What are you going to do? Take away my underwear?" In other words, he he, in his simplicity, understood that there is something wrong about, how the state is handling him in this particular case. But the violence extends in different ways also.
So tell us about the latest case that we heard about yesterday.
So recently we heard about a case. The information that we have is from the newspaper, actually. But the man has been refusing to give his wife a get. The rabbis ordered him to give a get. Apparently, he refused. Somehow he went abroad. They didn't manage to restrain his travel. And he went abroad and he married, and that's what the newspaper reports, he married another woman there. It's hard for me to understand how he married another woman there if he's still married according to Israeli law. So I'm not sure how that worked, because if in fact he did that, then obviously he's a bigamist and criminal proceedings could be brought against him in whatever country he's from. But his wife came to Israel. It appears to me, though I'm not sure again, that the wife is a foreign national, and the rabbinic court ordered her to come to the court. So first I have this question, under what right do they have to order her to come to court? She's not asking to marry or divorce. She might not even be an Israeli citizen. So on what right do they have to ask her to come to court? So the newspaper reports that she refused. And I think that if I were her attorney, I would also tell her to refuse, because they have no jurisdiction over her. They have no authority over her by any law. Even the new law, which we can get to, which expands the rabbinic court's jurisdiction to foreign nationals. And in that particular case, so what they did was they restrained her travel. They didn't let her go out of the country, which is a violation of the basic right to travel, which is considered a human right, and which all the countries respect. So when she wasn't allowed out of the country, she really had no choice, and she came to the rabbinic court. Again, according to the newspaper, they became convinced that somehow she was involved. This is also very ambiguous and amorphous in her husband's refusal to give his first wife the get, and they implicated her in it, and they continued to issue a restraining order on her. So this is an expression of violence, right? The abuse of the right of the state to infringe occasionally on the autonomy of individuals living within its territory. And the rabbis did it. I doubt if there was a trial. I don't know what had to be proved. I don't know what the burden of proof was. I don't know how they exercised such violence over someone who's a foreign national. And even if the person is an Israeli, I don't know how they did it in this particular case. But this is just another example, in my opinion, of gross violation of human rights, gross violation of this prerogative of violence given to the state in a manner that is arbitrary, capricious, without due process, random, without any rules, without any standards, and without any clear burdens of proof. When I express this feeling, people just don't get it,
Nobody understands it. I think what you're saying is so important. And when you say it, it's so clear. But all the women's organizations and anybody who hears the story is saying how amazing the dayanim is, and this is great, applauding it, and nobody's understanding what you say. And you've been saying these things for years.
Well, the rabbis are doing this now under so many different circumstances. And part of their power was expanded recently when they expanded the scope of the jurisdiction of the rabbinic courts to persons who are not Israelis and haven't given a religious divorce to their wives.
Right. And you were the only one there who was against it. I don't even think there are any non-religious Chavrei Knesset or anybody talking about it.
I'll tell you a story again about what happened recently at the Hartman Institute. One of the educators said to me, yeah, but he's not giving his wife a get. She's infringing on her freedom. And I said, okay, so should we flog him? Should we take out his eyes? And then they start thinking, well, oh, okay. Maybe putting in jail doesn't seem as bad as flogging. I think they'd all agree they're not going to cut off his hands or flog him or take out his eyes. But where's the line? Where do we draw the line? that's what I want to talk about, why I'm so passionate about the issue of violence, because I understand that this randomness and this lack of rules and this arbitrariness expresses itself all over. And this impingement on human rights has gotten out of control completely. In other words, we impinge on the rights of converts to sin like the rest of us. They will say, well, the convert had sex with their partner before marriage, so we can repeal their conversion. Or they infringe on the autonomy of individuals who want to marry when they start questioning their Jewishness, and the state allows them to do that. There are so many situations in which the rabbis are acting arbitrarily and capriciously in ways that go way beyond the bad husband who we seem to justify their actions. In other words, when there's a bad husband, we say, okay, you can throw him in jail because he's a bad husband. The end seems to justify the means, but they don't understand that this lack of adherence to human rights, or this lack of respect of human rights, or this lack of respect of fair trial or of the rule of law is really impinging on the heart of all of us.
It's scary. It can get out of hand completely. They can put people in jail for anything if they have power.
They don't let mothers be buried because their sons, who are foreign nationals, aren't giving gets to their wives in the manner that they think is a halachic way. In other words, we have that famous case that came about. So I think that this power has gotten totally out of hand, and I think it illustrates the problem of having a theocracy, which goes back to my issue and our issue of separation of church and state, that issues of religion should be private issues. People who want to adhere to these rules should have the right to adhere to them, but privately. And the state should not be involved in them, because look what happens when the state gives the rabbis the power of violence to impose the word of God as they understand it. This is what happens. And it's frightening to me, and it's not how I would like to see the state develop. And it seems to me that it's gotten out of control completely, especially if the women's organizations can't see it.
Are not understanding it. Yeah. Okay, this was really important. You had some great stuff to explain to us, and we should really go and study it a little. We should have a list of articles that you wrote and put it on the notes. Did you relate to any of those things in the book that you wrote?
I think in the very last chapter, I discuss all the human rights violations that are occurring.
Okay, so I'm going to mention this book and write it in the notes of the episode. The book is called Marriage and Divorce in the State of Israel, Israel's Civil War. And it's written by you, Susan Weiss, and a friend of yours, Nettie Gross Horowitz. It was put out by Brandeis University. It's really interesting. It's got great cases in it. And again, you talk about your ideas. We'll talk about my book at a different time, I think. Anyway, I think we'll wrap things up for today. It's been really important to understand all the stuff about religion and state and how when things get put together, it's not good for human rights, not good for women.
Not good for men.
Not good for men either.
Men can be put in jail for being stupid, and not because they did something that would necessarily be thought of as a terrible crime to humanity. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Rivkah. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Justice Unbound, Women, Religion, and the State of Israel, produced by the Center for Women's Justice. We would love to hear your comments and your thoughts. Please reach out to us on social media.
This podcast was produced thanks to the generous support of the Gimprich Family Foundation. Thank you, Rachel Stomel, for your help. I am Rivkah Lubitsch.
And I am Susan Weiss. Thank you for listening.